What's up, y'all? It's Phil, and it's time for another quick tip. So I've had a lot of people ask me about building custom dining tables, and one of the main things that they want to know if they're going to do a DIY one for themselves is what is the best joinery to put the tabletop together. Now this can range from biscuits to dowels to splining to all sorts of different things, and I'm going to show you a bunch of different techniques that I know today. They're going to range obviously in price of tools and ease of expertise, so I mean lots of different things that you can choose. I'm not going to really tell you which one is better, which one is stronger. I'm just going to let you guys decide for yourself which technique you would like to do for your DIY dining table. Now before we get started, it's very important that you understand most people are going to be using big box store construction grade lumber, and that's okay, but you need to take some precautions ahead of time. Make sure that when you get the wood, even though it's kiln dried, make sure that it is dry. So if you have a moisture meter, take one with you, get the driest pieces of wood you can. If you touch the wood and it feels cold to the touch in the big box store, don't buy it. It's way too wet for you to use. If you don't get wood that's dry enough, it is going to bend, it is going to twist, and really cheap pine from overseas is not good for furniture building at all. But I understand in the DIY market, that's usually what is available to you. I personally mill my own lumber, which I get from a local supplier, but I get it rough cut and gigantic, and I mill it down, cutting it to the exact size, dimensioning it, jointing it, flattening it, and doing all that myself. It's a lot of fun, but it requires a lot of expensive tools that most DIY guys aren't going to have. So in the spirit of making a DIY, I'm going to very simply tell you guys to get the straightest, driest boards you can, bring them home, let them acclimate in your house for about 2 to 3 weeks before you actually start building your project. If I were you and you're going to need like 7 boards, maybe go ahead and buy 10 boards so that way any of the boards that twist or warp on you, you can go ahead and take those back and just get your money back. And any boards that you don't use in the end of the project, you can also take back and get your money back. But that way, after they've acclimated for 3 weeks, you don't have to go and get more and wait another 3 weeks to actually use it on your project. So once you've got the driest, straightest boards with the least amount of knots that you can find, you want to take them back to your shop and somehow get them straight. So cut them down to size, get the edges as straight and flat as possible so that when you put them together as a dry fit, it almost looks like the table's complete. You want to make sure that you don't have any of those factory rounded over edges which are really ugly. You want to make sure that the surfaces are nice and smooth, and you want to make sure that those edges are joined so flat that when you put the glue in there, there's going to be no room for anything, and this is going to glue right to itself. You don't have to like clamp it and crimp it down. Also, if you have a pocket hole jig, go ahead and put it in a drawer, lock it up there, and forget that you even have it, because that's not ever good for dining table tops. And I'll tell you why. When you're doing your glue up, if you're putting pocket hole screws in, 1, you're probably not doing your glue up right to begin with. 2, a traditional glue up is just a lamination of flat boards with glue pushed together, clamped together, and let to dry. Once the glue cures, it's stronger in that joint than the wood itself is. So that is actually all you really need to do a good glue up. However, for a tabletop, we want to add a little bit of extra strength. And sometimes, especially when using construction grade lumber, you get some difference in height and you want to make sure that it's all nice and flat. So sometimes some of these techniques are really nothing more than just aligning the boards, even if they don't add more strength. Pocket holes will never do that. If you use a pocket hole screw to pull one board down to where it's level with the other, it is going to fail, because the more that board tries to pull away, it is eventually going to pull out of those threads, break the glue line, and you're done. So we're going to put pocket holes away. That is a horribly improper technique that no one should ever use on a tabletop. But here's the techniques that are good for traditional tabletop building, especially for the DIY. Especially for the DIYer. Shut up, birds. So I want to show you this as a comparison. This board right here is a 2x6 that I was planning on using for this video. It is one of the leftovers from this dining table, which is made in the style of the techniques that I'm about to show you. And it is sitting on a piece of poplar that is a month old, and the poplar is half of its width and is completely flat. It's over 12 inches wide and it's 10 feet long. And yet this 8-foot piece of pine is 2 days old and sitting in my shop, which has a 35% relative humidity in this room and is currently 77 degrees. It has bowed and twisted, so you can see the twist there, and also you can see how badly bowed it is. This thing is completely unusable, and I bought it 2 days ago. So that is exactly why I say you need to go and get your boards and you need to let them acclimate, because when this happens, I can return this to the big box store. So take that with a grain of salt, but this happens to me about 30% of the time that I buy big box store lumber. Now, these are my sample pieces. They have been straightened, flattened, jointed, cleaned up real nice, which is actually kind of cool. I do kind of like the look of pine when it's all clean, but I hate the way it performs. So, here's what we're gonna do. Board number one is going to be a traditional laminate, and that means we're going to just glue one board to the other. Nothing but glue and a straight edge, that's it. Number two, we're going to be doing dowels. Now, dowels are pretty cool because you have really two options there. You can do a nice thick dowel with a Forstner bit, and that's going to really kind of help everything level out. Or if you want to get a little less complicated and you just want to line these up properly, we're going to use regular traditional 1/4 inch dowels, and those are going to just lock the boards in place vertically to keep this top nice and flat. For board number three, we're going to be using biscuits. Biscuits are small pieces of like MDF or like a real thin plywood piece. They're kind of like a football shape, and they go between the two with a rounded off mortise that allows the piece to fit real tight and get a lot of glue in there. It really helps with aligning everything. It doesn't help a whole lot with splitting the boards apart, but you can see how tight my boards already are, and this is just them sitting on the table. So this is a good dry fit with the biscuits in there. That's going to help align everything, and it's a super easy process and a really cool tool to use. Number four is going to be the spline technique. Now, splining is really cool, and I'm putting it towards the end of the video because I want you guys to watch this whole thing, but splining is actually one of the easiest processes out of all of these. It does require a table saw, but if you straighten your boards on a table saw sled, you already understand how to use a table saw. And last but not least, we're going to be doing technique number five, which is what I currently do. It's one of my favorites, and it is obviously the most expensive. It is the Domino. I have the Domino XL. It cuts a 12mm Domino. I'm going to show that to you just because I think it's super awesome, and I think you might like it, and learning about it is cool. It also explains why these techniques work as well, and it basically combines these two, adds in some awesomeness, and is its own thing. So we're going to combine all of those. The main thing about this laminate right here is that we're going to be applying glue between every single joint anyway. So it's best that we go ahead and learn about the laminate first, and then we go ahead and talk about the other four techniques. So the first technique is relatively easy, and that is the laminate. So I'm going to start with my two pieces, set them in some clamps. Make sure you've got just enough room that you can set them in and then start clamping them down. And all we're going to do is turn these up on edge and then go ahead and apply a pretty good amount of glue on top. I like to spread it out with I've got an old paint roller that I constantly use. If you're not going to constantly be using glue, this is kind of wasteful, so for me it's not, but for the typical DIY person it might be. You can always just use your finger or a squeegee or one of those little silicone brushes that they sell at the store. But that's all you really need to do. So now these have glue on them. Set one down here, make sure that my lines line up, and give it a good clamp. Now you don't want to clamp it down too hard, and you don't want to put too much pressure on one side as opposed to the other, because you'll notice that your lines start to slide so they don't line up. So I'm going to keep tightening these down, alternating, so that all the lines line up properly. There we go. And then you want to get all the excess glue off. Just wiping that down with a wet paper towel is usually the best way to go. And then if for some reason your boards aren't lining up, like mine here on the end, you want to grab another clamp and go ahead and just apply a little bit of pressure on there, just enough to even it out. You don't want to clamp it down too much to where it's going to cause any damage to the wood or going to offset the pieces. Alright, and that right there is a basic laminate. So I'm going to set that aside, let it dry for a couple hours. We'll continue going. Our second technique is doweling, and it requires a doweling jig. Now I've got this one preset to the exact width of my boards, which is right at 1.5 inches, and I'm going to be using the 1/4 inch hole and the 1/4 inch drill bit. Now for the first technique, you're going to need some 1/4 inch dowels. But the second technique I'm going to show you is actually something that I came up with before I got the Domino. I knew how to dowel and I had the doweling jig, and so I would use this to simply mark the spot. I wouldn't actually make my cut. Then I would use a 3/4 inch Forstner bit and a 3/4 inch dowel cut down to 1.5 inches, and I would use these like I would a regular dowel, except these are much sturdier and much closer to the action of the Domino. It takes a little bit longer and it's not exactly perfect, but it is stronger and better than the little 1/4 inch dowels as far as alignment goes. So just something to consider. I'm going to go ahead and show you both. So doweling is actually pretty simple. I've already got my access lines here. So the first step I want to do is grab a square, and I'm just very simply going to carry these lines around the side of every single board. And again, just like with every other technique, your outermost board is only going to have dowels on one side. All your inner boards are going to have dowels on both sides. So you're going to carry the lines around the side of both sides of all the center boards. Once that's done, very simply take your doweling jig, stick it on here. The 1/4 inch hole is the one in the middle that I'm going to be using. And all I need to do is either do this visually, where I can see straight down onto the line, make sure that that is centered. So now all you've got to do is drill straight down through, and I've got a stop collar on this thing so that it will only go to the depth I want it to. Now for the last one, I am going to do it a little bit differently. I'm going to line it up like normal. There it is. And I'm just going to put the point in, and that's it. So that marks my exact center point. So now I can switch to my 3/4 Forstner bit, and using that point I can stick the brad in the hole, and I've got 3/4 of an inch marked right here. I can drill down a 3/4 inch deep hole, and now you can see the difference between the little dowels and the big dowel. And when I go to install that bad boy, it's going to be a lot more substantial. So now I just need to repeat that on the other side of the board and go ahead and get them put together, and then I'm going to clamp this whole thing up and let it dry overnight. For our third technique, we're going to use biscuits. Now, the biscuits that I'm choosing to use are number 20 FSC wood biscuits. Don't really know what all that means, but I do know that the jointer that I have has settings for that. So I've set my jointer to 20, number 20 there. I've got my depth set so that it's going to cut almost exactly at the middle of the board. And the way this thing works is it is a jointer that literally pushes back and a circular saw blade comes out. It's a very small little blade with nice thick kerf on it, so it cuts just enough of a mortise for these footballs to fit inside of there with some glue as well. Now the way this is going to work is using my lines that I previously marked. I'm going to set the biscuit jointer on top and line up the line with the guide, and then activate it, push it in, pull it out, and you've got a mortise cut. And that's it. Those mortises are cut. I use these lines, which I marked on both boards, so that when I do put the biscuits in, everything is going to line back up, and those holes are cut exactly even with each other. So, I'm going to go ahead and do the glue up. All that entails is putting glue across the boards just like we did with our laminate, also putting in biscuits in one side and spreading a little bit of glue on them, pressing everything together, and you got yourself a joint. Now at this point, just like with your other laminate, you want to go ahead and clamp this together, but since I'm doing it on the small scale, I'm just going to leave it right here, and we're going to move on to number 4. Now number 4 is a pretty cool technique. It requires a table saw and a ripping blade. It also requires you to go and get some either underlayment or 1/4 inch plywood, which if you're getting 1/4 inch plywood from the big box store, it's not going to be a 1/4 inch, it's going to be about 3/16 of an inch. So plan on doing that math and doing a lot of test fitting to make sure that everything fits the way that it should. But what we're going to do is we're going to cut a 1.5 inch spline and we're going to cut a 3/4 inch mortise into each piece, and we're going to join those together. So let me show you how that's done. So the first thing we're going to do here is rip our 1/4 inch or whatever thickness piece down to 1.5 inches, and you want it to be the full length of the core of your table. So for example, if I'm doing an 8-foot table, that's 96 inches total. If I know my breadboard inches, if I know my breadboard ends are going to be around 5.5 inches each, that's 11 inches off. 8 foot, 7 foot is 84 inches, so that means I'm going to need an 85 inch long piece because I'm going to have 85 inch long boards for the core of my tabletop. For the example purposes here, I have 24 inch pieces, so I'm going to be using a 24 inch spline. Pretty simple. So now we are over here at the table saw. I've got a basic piece of underlayment that I picked up. It's not very thick. It's just shy of a 1/4 inch. So I'm going to pull this guy over, and what I want to do is measure to the inside kerf at exactly 1.5 inches. And it's better to err on the side of too small because that gives you more room for your glue than too big, in which you won't actually be able to clamp the pieces together because the piece inside will be too thick. So I'm just a hair shy of 1.5, which is perfect. I'm going to go ahead and rip that right now. Now the next step is cutting the mortises in your tabletop pieces, and it's really, really important to make sure that you have everything lined up perfectly. So I've already got my tabletop marked with black lines that go all the way across. So now I know which is the top, which is the bottom. What I'm going to do is go ahead and set my table saw blade so that the kerf of my saw blade, where it lines up with my table saw fence, when I line that up from the edge of this table saw to the outside kerf of the blade is going to be 3/4 of an inch. And that's because we're going to end up making 2 passes that are going to hollow out enough material that our piece is going to fit in between the two. Now I'm going to set the depth of the blade so that the top of the kerf is hitting just exactly at 3/4 of an inch, maybe just a touch more to add some room for glue. Now it's very important that once you set your fence, it's very, very important that you make all the same cuts on all of your boards. So your 2 outside boards should look like this, where they have no cut here and they have a single cut here. All of your center boards need to have 2 cuts, 1 on each side, okay? So what you're gonna do, set your top against your fence, pass it through, turn it around to the bottom, pass it through again. Flip it over so the top is against the fence again, pass it through, turn it around, pass it through. If this isn't enough to fit your spline, that's okay. Go ahead and do that same thing to every single board so that all your mortises are cut. But they're too small, Phil. I know. go ahead and then adjust your blade a little bit so that your fence is slightly closer, only about maybe half the kerf of the saw. Make sure it's slightly closer to the inside kerf of that blade, putting the top side of your board against the fence, run it through one more time. Do that to every single board again. That way all of your mortises are the exact same. Even though now they're slightly closer to the top, that's okay, because guess what? If your spline still doesn't fit, you can flip it over this way again and now run the back against the fence, and it's going to cut this even wider. So always do top side first, flip over to the bottom side, and if it's one of the center boards, flip it up, top side again, bottom side again. Once all those cuts are made, even if everything doesn't fit, go ahead and adjust your fence slightly closer to the blade. Go ahead and cut on the top side again, test fit. If it still doesn't fit, cut all the bottom sides again. Make sure that all of your mortises are the exact same on every single board, because if you have some that the height difference here and the next board isn't the same, your boards are going to be uneven when we put everything together. So I've done my test fit and it is awesome. It fits really, really well in there. It's not too tight, but it's not loose at all. In fact, yeah, see, it's got just enough room in there that there's some friction, the glue's gonna hold really well, and it fits all the way in to the base. So I'm really happy with that. I'm gonna go ahead and cut a spline in the other board. Now it's very important if you're splining a table that you cut a mortise in both sides. Okay, because this board is gonna, the end board only has one mortise. The next 5 boards will have mortises on each side, and then the other edge board will only have one mortise, if that makes sense. So each board is gonna have one spline between every 2 boards. So if you have 7 boards total, you'll have 6 splines. Pretty easy math. So now that I've got my mortises cut, it's actually a very simple process to put this thing together. Very lightly squirt a little bit of glue in so that it runs down the sides and goes across the bottom. And we're going to go ahead and do that to both sides of our spline. Now that that's been done, I'm going to take my spline itself and put a little bit of glue on it and spread it around using my finger or using this guy. And this is really just enough to get into the top pores of the spline itself. This isn't enough glue to actually hold it in place, but that's okay because we're going to go back later and we're going to add more glue. So once I've done this to both sides of the spline, I can actually go ahead and flatten out the little bit of glue that I got on there. And I do want to add just a little bit of glue, because once again, just like our first lamination, we also want the flat parts of our boards to have glue touching them so that when they go together, they've got a little bit of glue holding them together as well, and not just the spline. Once everything has adequately got glue on it, you take your spline, press it into the middle here. It should be just tight enough that it's not exactly easy to get it in, but it shouldn't take a whole lot of force. And now that that's in place, add a little bit of glue on the ender here. I'm going to add my other piece, lining up those alignment lines again, press everything together, and wipe away the excess glue. Now, if I were splining the entire tabletop, I would already have a spline cut here. I would just add glue, add the next spline, add the next board, add glue, add the next spline, add the next board, and just keep going all the way through my tabletop that way. But that looks great. That is clean. That is in place the way it's supposed to be. I really like it. So I'm going to go ahead and let this dry, and we're going to move on to technique number 5. Now it's time for technique number 5. This is by far my favorite technique. It's one of the fastest and the most expensive. Now when I do production runs, it is very important that I have one of these, and it works really, really well for me. This is the Festool Domino XL. Sorry, I was looking at the side. It's the DF700 EQ of the model, but it's the Domino XL. This thing is amazing. It has an oscillating 12mm head that comes out very similar to the way the Biscuit joiner does. And it is able to be set at all types of different depths and do 1,000 different things. For tabletops, it's really great for just cutting mortises to fit these 12mm beechwood dominoes. Now what's great about that is I can cut out 20mm on each board like we just did for the spline. We cut one hole in each way, and then these dominoes go into one side, but half of them goes in, half of them sticks out, which goes into the other side. So you basically kind of middle the domino right between the two boards, and it's a really great way to put these together. It helps with keeping the boards flat, and also it does actually add some structural strength to this thing. Most of these other techniques don't. The splining does because it multiplies the glued surface by about 6. These guys actually add some as well. So it's a very good technique. The splining is one of the cheapest and easiest and uses the least tools. This is the most expensive, although it is by far the absolute quickest and the easiest and the best, but it's not in the price range for most DIY people. But I'm going to show it to you anyway. Just like the Biscuit joiner, it is set to a certain depth where it's going to cut just about the middle of the board. And all I have to do is turn it on, line it up, make sure the vacuum hose actually stays attached, and push it in, pull it out. Do that to each spot where I'm going to be joining the boards on both sides. So on each board there's going to be holes on both sides, except the end boards, they're only going to have holes on the inside edge. So let me go ahead and show you how this works. So now that that step's done, all I have to do is apply glue along the flat edge and in the holes, and then put the dominoes in. Now the dominoes are glued in place. I'm going to put a little bit of glue on each one. Spread it around just a bit. You don't really need a whole lot of glue on the dominoes because you don't want to cause undue pressure inside the wood. You simply want to have something that is going to glue and grab just a little bit while it's in there. And then all I need to do is line up my alignment points and my lines again, and the dominoes really make this super easy because with their rounded off edges, they kind of line themselves up, which is pretty great. Now in my experience, they do take a little more persuasion, so I made this. I call it the Persuader. It's completely Osage orange, and I put a nice little piece of oak up here and just persuade it. Now that they are together, they're together nice and tight. Go ahead and sweep off the glue, and just like with the spline, you would basically do the exact same thing. There would already be pre-cut mortises here. I would put more glue, more dominoes, the next board, more glue, more dominoes, next board, and so on and so forth until I completed my table. And that's it. All 5 techniques, from the laminate to the dowels to the biscuits to the spline to the dominoes, holding everything together. I'm going to go ahead and clamp this up just like I would a normal tabletop, and then I'm going to show you how they look on the inside. Now, one of the ways to know you did your glue up right is when you are clamping everything down. You shouldn't have to clamp really, really tight to get the boards to touch. They should already be touching even in dry fit. So with that glue between them, you should have a good seal, but you want to go ahead and clamp it down just a little bit so that you can hand tighten it just enough that it squeezes some of the glue back out. If there's not a lot of glue coming out or not at all, then you didn't put enough glue on. If the glue starts pouring out, you put way too much on and you might actually weaken the joint. So just a little bit of glue on both sides of the board, press together and clamp. You get a little bit of squeeze out, wipe it off with a wet paper towel, let it cure overnight, and you're good to go. All right, so I went ahead and cut this thing up so you guys can see how each of these work, and we're gonna give them a quick little break test. So this is the coolest part. First off, we have the straight up laminate. So this is just two boards joined together with glue, and if you do this for a tabletop, you can see how tight those seams are. The glue fills it in really, really nicely, and it holds extremely well. Next up is our dowel. Now the dowel is sideways, so even though it looks like it's nice and long, it's really not. That's only about 1/8 of an inch that's left in there. So you have 1/4 of an inch total for the dowel, and it's 3/4 inches long either way. You can see that my drill bit went a little deeper than the actual dowel, which is okay because there's still glue making contact on all sides of the dowel rods, as well as you can see that black in there, that's the dried glue from where I also laminated the boards together. So dowels are, you know, pretty decent for lining everything up. They don't really do anything structurally. Now let's move on to the biscuits. So again, side profile. So this looks really small compared to that football that we put in there, but you can see the layers of the plywood. So you've got a little bit more rigidity there, and it is obviously much longer than it is wide. So this is the width here, and it actually looks very similar to another one, the Spline. Biscuit, Spline. So this is why I like the Spline the best as far as the easy DIY ones, is because you have this same idea that we do with the biscuits, where it's the double, you know, mortise on each side with a piece that goes through the middle, except the difference is this piece is much wider, obviously filled in the space, you know, almost as well, but it goes from one end all the way to the other end. The biscuits don't do that. So I know that this spline runs all the way through the tabletop, and that's going to give me a lot more gluing surface. I mean, that's like 6 times the gluing surface as opposed to just gluing it across the middle, which I also did. So the two boards are glued together as well as the entire spline having glue on it, and that turned out really well. Now you can also see though, see how it's not perfectly flat and even on the very top and bottom? That's because me, like a dummy, I accidentally let it slip just a little bit when I was running it through the table saw, and it wound up uneven. That is the one risk that you run when doing the spline. So if you're going to do this technique, I highly, highly recommend you practice it a little bit to make sure that all of your splines are going to be perfect, and don't feel bad about creeping up on the line, because the better and tighter the fit is, the better it's going to be, so that you don't wind up with uneven boards like I have here. Finally, we're going to move on to our last one, the Domino. Now this is kind of cool because you can see how much thicker this thing is. Obviously I cut a 40mm hole, and my dominoes I think are exactly like 38.5mm or something like that, so there's a little bit of room in there. Usually you should fill in with glue, but I never want to put too much pressure in there. There is glue all up and down the sides, and of course the seam between the boards has glue as well. So you've got a nice tight glue up there. This is much wider and thicker than the Biscuit, which I like. It also does provide a lot of structural support because this is a solid piece of wood. The grain is going opposite the grain, obviously, that's in the actual piece here. So you're kind of treating it like plywood, where you've got the grain going in opposite directions, which adds to the strength. It also adds up a little bit. Where the dominoes are, you have about 6 to 8 times the gluing surface, which is great. However, unlike the spline, it doesn't go all the way through the table. It's only in those small areas where the dominoes are. Now the last one I want to show you is on the other side of the table. This is our large dowel. Now as you can see here, I clearly didn't do it right. And that's my own fault. In fact, the glue in there is still kind of wet. But this is the 3/4 inch dowel that I should have cut longer, obviously, because you want it to go from end to end so that this glue is actually attached there. But you get the gist of the idea. Very similar to the Domino, it fills in a lot of space there, and they're almost the same size. So just to show you a literal side-by-side comparison, these are my cutoffs. This is the Domino down here. This is the dowel up here. Again, I cut the dowel to the wrong length, but size-wise, it's fitting in there perfectly the way that it's supposed to, top to bottom. I will show you this. The difference in the Domino and the dowel is that the Domino is flat on the top and bottom, which gives you a little bit more surface area, and it's also got some ridges in it that on a very small level just keep adding additionally to that gluing surface, which is a good thing. The dowel is a little thick, which means that it actually ends up making the top and bottom here a little thinner than I'd like, because then your flex points don't leave enough wood grain there, and that could be a problem later on in the future. But this is what I was doing before I bought this tool. This tool is very expensive. This tool is relatively cheap because it's a Forstner bit and a bunch of measuring. You have to learn how to do it right. It's not as easy, but once you get used to it, it's actually pretty easy to do the dowels if you can't afford a Domino. So let's do some break tests. Now, on woodworking forums and things like that, they claim that the glue itself is actually stronger than the wood. And while that is true to an extent, the wood grain also makes a huge difference. So I don't necessarily have a lot of faith in this piece here, because even though it's a very good lamination, I didn't really pay attention to the grain when I was putting these together. And yes, I have a down-up alternating grain pattern, but I think this is going to be a nice weak point for me. Let's find out. Yep, I was right. The wood did break, and the joint did not break. The wood broke right along that grain. If I'd had a better board in this place, it probably would not have broken there. It probably would have broken somewhere farther up. But that took a lot of force, and it didn't break on my joint, which is actually what I was trying to prove. That's a good thing. All right, this next one is the dowel. There's not really much left there, so it's really gonna be very similar to the just traditional lamination, but let's see what happens. Oh, wow. So yeah, once again, it broke. In fact, it broke across the grain, which is kind of surprising. The dowel didn't even get touched, and like I said, there's really not even much of a dowel there. This is almost more of just a traditional lamination, and it was still stronger than the wood itself. So again, that's pretty successful. It didn't do much structurally, but it did help me line up the boards, and then the traditional lamination is now stronger than the wood itself. So that's cool. Now let's check out the biscuits. I'll push on this. Okay, wait. That broke too easy. I think that there was already a split in the wood. Find the other. There you go. There's the other biscuit. This won't be as easy, but we can try it. There you go. Same thing. The biscuit didn't really do much from a structural standpoint. The lamination is really what's doing all the work here, but again, it broke along the grain here, as you can see, and it broke across the grain. It did take a little more force, but only because I didn't really have much of a lever here, but it took a good amount of force. That's a Osage orange mallet that I made. Yeah, that took a good amount of force, and it didn't break the seam. It broke all the way over here. Now let's test the spline. I'm pretty confident that this is also going to, yep, that held really strong. That board didn't take much effort to break, which is unfortunate, but this didn't even flex. I kind of expected that. I expected this would be really, really strong, so that's actually really cool that it worked that way. And finally, the Domino. So we have the Domino going across there. I'm a little wary because there's a bad joint back here that is not connected, but we shall see. No, look at that. That's kind of funny. The joint, which I already knew was probably bad, it had a knot down here, it had no connection there. It failed, but once again, it didn't fail exactly on the joint. It's the grain next to it that failed, and then of course the Domino just came right out. I'd call that one a bit of a fluke. All right, so now I've got the other Domino clamped up. This one actually has a good joint. Let's see what happens. Boom. So once again, big heavy show of force. Nothing happened along that joint. We've got a good glue up as well as the Domino in there, providing some extra structural support. And the wood broke along the grain, and not only did it break along the grain, but it broke along my pivot point, which means that was actually a pretty strong piece of wood as well. A lot of the other pieces have been breaking all the way out here. This one had to use the mallet for force and broke all the way up here at the pivot point. So that's a good strong joint. Super proud of that one. And last but not least, we have our bonus. So similar to the Domino, we have our 3/4 inch dowel. It's not as strong, but we have a very good glue up. I cannot stress how important it is that you have a good, straight, stress-free glue up no matter what joining technique you're using. So let's see how this holds up. Boom. Hey, look at that! It broke in 2 places. Not only did it snap here, away from my pivot point, but it also hit the ground and the wood just snapped on its own right there. So already, this piece of wood was a weak, bad piece of wood that had some fissures in it. That's why it's been splitting so easily. This piece was much stronger, but actually broke farther out than I thought. But that joint is still not stressed at all. Partly because of this piece giving it some more rigidity, but mostly because I had a good glue up across the middle. I know what you're thinking. Well, hey, that's cool. You can break some little ender pieces that you cut off, but that's not a whole tabletop. Obvi. Guys, a fun way to test your joints is when you do have a nice thick cutoff, when you're straightening that edge of your table, is to try and snap them and see where they snap. And if it snaps along a joint, you know you may have a problem. If it snaps the grain somewhere, you're pretty good. That's a pretty good test. But just for funsies, let's use the remainder of this thing and see where I can make it fail. Full send! Wow! I'm actually super happy with this. Y'all, check this out. The only one that even came close to failure is the laminate, and it didn't. The actual joint, as you can see, starting with this board, it actually broke along that board, and then this board broke along this board. So they both broke along the grain at the joint, but the joint itself did not break. So I think that's partly because I did it on a 2x4, and partly because that is the weakest part of the wood. But again, this glue supposedly is stronger than the wood itself, and that joint just proves it. It didn't snap along a nice straight joint. It ripped out wood from both sides, and it took my whole body weight just slamming into it like I was mad at a skateboard. The dowels did perfect. I'm really impressed by that. Because that to me says good laminate, and this is where my foot landed. That's my heel, that's my toes. This should have snapped, and it didn't. I'm rather impressed by that. Again, it's mostly just a good laminate that just happens to have the dowels to line it up. They didn't do anything structurally, but that looks good. Biscuits! They had a failure, but just like my test piece, it failed next to the biscuit. And you can see that because look, there's a biscuit right there. There's a biscuit right there. So it was, in fact, the piece of wood that failed, not the biscuit, and it was in the direct center. This is what was between my feet. There's a footprint, there's a footprint. That shouldn't have failed, but I'm glad that it failed so catastrophically along the wood and not along this beautiful seam right here. That, once again, just proves that even the biscuits are a good joining method. Again, just like the dowels, they're more for lining it up than they are structurally, because you see how easy those pulled out. That means they're not doing anything structurally, but they did help me line up the boards and get them nice and flat. Next to go is my favorite, and of course it held up amazingly well like I knew it would, and that is the spline. And what's cool about this is that, again, it goes all the way through, so you've got that support holding this whole thing together. It's got 6 times the amount of glue that this joint did. So this right here held up so well that even with my foot landing directly on it, just like the dowel, we've got a good glue up, we've got a good glue up, plus a glue up, another glue up, another glue up, and then a glue up. And this has a ton of surface area that is glued together. This will probably survive longer than this will, but that is awesome. And the fact that it failed on this piece, and this piece was one of my hardest pieces to cause failure with, and it split so badly right up in the, I mean, look how hard that had to split. That one really got jagged and ripped up. So that just goes to prove that these two joints are the strongest, which is the spline and the domino. Now the domino already has a weak piece of wood here. This is that piece that failed my first test. This is that piece that passed my second test. And this just goes to show, with this being up on the 2x4, it should have failed as catastrophically as this, but with those dominoes in there for that extra support, it held extremely straight and strong, which caused the pressure coming here with this strong joint and the pressure coming here from the 2x4 with this strong joint, it made this the weakest spot and caused such a catastrophic failure. That is awesome. Now, why am I so excited about that? I didn't get any of the joints to fail even when I jumped on it and destroyed my project. That's the point. I'm excited by that because it proved exactly what I set out to show in this video, Mythbuster style, which is all of these techniques work. All of these techniques work well. but none are really wrong or necessarily better, although some are cheap and some are very expensive. So it really depends on what's going to work for you and work for your budget and in your shop. I am doing production stuff. I am doing higher end tables with harder wood. I have the Domino XL with the 12mm bit. I swear by these things. I absolutely love them. However, doing just simple laminates like you would with a cutting board or whatever is what I do for my skateboards. And I've only ever had one fail, and it didn't fail along the joint. The wood split. So again, just a traditional glue laminate is the cheapest, easiest way to go if you have a perfectly straight edge, even with this crappy construction lumber. If you want to line stuff up better, there's the dowels, but that takes a little bit of expertise, and that's not as easy as spending 120 bucks and getting yourself a biscuit joiner and some biscuits. Do that, everything's going to line up top to bottom really easy. You have to make sure that your lines line up because the biscuits can allow the boards to slide back and forth a little bit, but using those access lines that let you know, hey, this is where you need to be lining the boards up again, makes it super easy because that's where you're cutting your mortises, and that's also where you want to line the boards back up. Splining is by far my favorite. It's one of the easiest to learn. It's one of the most idiot-proof as long as you do it right when you're doing it step by step and cutting every single board. You have to batch out your entire table at one time. But that's going to save you time. It's going to save you money on tools and stuff. You can do it all on your table, and you can do it all on your table saw, and it's kind of fun knowing that you did that yourself. Also, if you don't put breadboard ends on your table, you get this nice, cool looking spline. And I've seen guys that do like a walnut tabletop with a red oak spline or a cherry spline. And it looks really cool sticking out of those ends. So that's by far my favorite. It is by far one of the strongest joints out of all of these, including over the Domino, because it goes all the way through and provides so much gluing surface area that depending on what you put in here is what's going to determine how strong it is. Using this 1/4 inch plywood or this 3/16 plywood that I've got in here is not as strong as using a solid strip of wood that's cut down to 3/16 or a 1/4 inch. So I would honestly recommend, if you've got the time and ability, to cut yourself some real thin 1/4 inch shims and make if you've got the time, I would go ahead and make some real thin 1.5 inch by 1/4 inch splines out of some sort of hardwood, and make sure that the grain is not on a spot that's going to snap if it gets too much stress. Go ahead and cut yourself some of those. Maybe even layer up one or two that have some differing grains, glue them together, and then glue them in here. You get a nice strong spline. It's one of the best ways to go, and it's one of the cheapest, most efficient, and in my opinion, most fun to do if you're just doing this for funsies. Obviously, we have the Domino. I already talked about that one. It's very expensive, but I love it. Now that you've seen how all of these techniques work and how to apply them, I'm going to very quickly show you how to attach breadboard ends to your dining table, because there's one extremely important fact about that we need to go over before I let you guys go. So now let's go ahead and talk about those breadboard ends. If you are going to be attaching a breadboard end to your tabletop, that means that all of your core pieces that we were talking about earlier, like when I was talking about these being 85 inches across for an 8-foot table, we're going to make up the rest of it to make it 96 inches long with these guys. So these are 5.5 inches wide. They're a typical 6x6 that has been milled down a little bit. One side is cut perfectly straight. The other side still has the weirdo factory edge, but we're going to sand it nice and smooth later on to get it finished up. The main thing about the breadboard end is what it does. This is not just aesthetic, as most of the mommy vloggers will have you believe. This actually serves a purpose, which is the main reason why pocket holes are absolutely not going to work. And if they don't fail across the tabletop here, this is where they will fail. So I'm going to give you a brief explanation real quick on why this matters, and then I'm going to show you a couple different ways to attach it that will actually work. So for starters, I've got my alignment marks put on here. These are going to be very useful no matter which technique you choose, because if you're using a Domino or a biscuit joiner, you're going to need that on both ends of the board so you know where you're cutting your mortises. If you're doweling, you need to be able to carry that line around the edge of both sides of the board so you can mark your dowels, and your dowels are going to basically just hold everything in place. This unfortunately will not work doing a traditional glue up, because there is no way to traditionally glue up your breadboard ends. We are only going to be gluing about the center third or so, and you can actually kind of see on this one, I've left the dried glue on here for the purpose of showing that. It is only glued from about here to here, there is a domino in this center one, and it's super glued up, so it's not going to move. Everything else, however, is going to move and also has the potential to cup up and down. This breadboard end is going to prevent the tabletop from curving up or down or twisting, and in doing so, it needs to have something to grab onto. So if you try to just glue this together, it's going to break that seam and it's going to expand. The core is going to expand out on both sides. If you pocket hole it, you're going to pocket hole it in place, and it's just going to push that pocket hole screw out and do the exact same thing, which is why we don't ever use pocket hole screws on a dining tabletop. Have I said that enough yet? I don't think so. No matter which method you use, when the center is glued in place, it's going to cut down the amount of expansion and contraction that we have across the tabletop, because now instead of the whole table moving back and forth whatever way it can, or if it's screwed into the apron, which is also the wrong way to do it, the tabletop is going to be centered here. And if you attach it to your table using something like Z-clips, or even if you do use a screw to hold the center of the table in place, as long as the outside edges of the table are floating using Z-clips or tabletop fasteners, however you want to do that, then it has the ability to expand and contract without causing added stress. That means, though, that the breadboard ends need to have what's called a sliding mortise. It is possible to do with dowels, although again it's not as strong because the dowels are not as rigid. If you do use the 3/4 inch dowels, they're much more rigid, which keep it from moving up and down. It's not as easy of a process to do, but you can do it, especially if you have a drill press or something that you can use that bigger Forstner bit on without it slipping. Biscuits work pretty well. This one is actually held together with biscuits only, and all this is glued in. There's a biscuit right here, and there's biscuits here and here. I think I said domino earlier, but it's a biscuit. In fact, there's two biscuits, one on top of the other, and those are holding this together. These two are just in place, and all they're doing is keeping that board flat and rigid. They're not actually glued in or secured in any way. So, assuming this board doesn't start bowing out away from the table, which it's pine, so who knows, as long as it's going to stay nice and straight, which I did my cuts and got everything straight and perfect. Now that it's joined, when this was clamped and glued, with this being so tight, it should hold everything tight enough that those pieces can just move inside of the mortises that were cut by the biscuit joiner machine. Obviously, the dominoes are going to work the same way as the biscuits, except I have a 140mm domino, so a very long little bad boy that's going to go in there from 70mm out all the way through where it's middled to 70mm in to the breadboard end. The main thing is that those are much more rigid, keep everything flat, but I do have to also cut oblong holes and pin them in place. Let me show you what I'm talking about. So after cutting my mortises, I can install the dominoes into the dining table top. Now the domino has two settings on it, one for 13mm holes and one for 16.5mm holes. For the tabletop core, I will only drill the 13 so that way when the domino slides in with glue, it's going to just stay there. It's not going to have any room to move. So it's solid in the core, and it's long enough that it doesn't have any way to move left or right. It's just going to stay perfectly straight 90-degree angle to the core. In the breadboard end, however, only the center mark is going to be a 13mm hole. The outside four are going to be lined up with the ones on the core, but they're going to be 16.5mm holes, which gives me about 1.25mm on either side of the domino once installed, that when the table is expanding and contracting seasonally, it has that room to move within the breadboard end. One extra step I like to do just to hold everything in place, it's not 100% necessary, but it's probably best practices, is to go ahead and pin the dominoes in place using dowel rods. So after installing the dominoes in the tabletop, I then pre-measure where I want my holes to be, and using a 1/4 inch brad point drill bit, I drill a hole with another hole right next to it and twist the bit to kind of combine the two into one long oblong hole. Then on the breadboard end, once it's installed, I can drill holes straight through the tabletop that's just a single hole and install a dowel pin rod. Now this pin in the center of the table is going to just hold it in place and hold it very tight because it has nowhere to go. However, on the two outer for the left and the right sides, it's going through that oblong hole, but it's held in place solidly in the breadboard end. As the table core expands and contracts, that pin can slide back and forth inside that oblong hole, which is going to prevent the tabletop from having stress and splitting apart while still allowing for the seasonal wood movement. Sometimes just for show, I even like to do pins inside the table core itself. So I have pins on the core side that are just drilled straight through the table and the domino, put a pin in, sand it off, and then I have the functional pins with the sliding mortises on the breadboard end. I do that mostly for looks. However, it does add a little bit of added strength because I clamp this whole thing up and get it super tightly clamped, put the pins in, and then when you release it, that holds the pins so that the breadboard is holding it even tighter, almost as tight as the clamps were. It puts a little bit of extra stress, but not too much for the pins, and it's enough to keep those breadboards tight throughout the years. I have had the dominoes start to pull out because the breadboard ends are too tight, so doing those pins in the table core as well as in the breadboard end kind of help with that. So let's reverse engineer this for a moment from the perspective of the domino. The domino is one of the ones that works the best if you're going to be adding mortises and tenons to the end of your freshly cut, perfectly straight table core. However, you have to remember that you have that wood expansion. So whatever you use in the center, whether it is a biscuit, whether it is a domino, whether it is a dowel or a large 3/4 inch dowel, that one in the center, one hole here, tenon in the middle, you're good to go. However, your outer two on the left and your outer two on the right, on the table, you need whatever's installed in the core to be solid. So your biscuits, your tenons, whatever, your pins, your dowels, all of that stuff is installed solidly in the dining table end. In your breadboard end, it's very important that that center one, like I said, is already just, it's going to be secured straight in. However, your outer ones need to have a little bit extra. So for biscuits, you don't really have to worry because they already have a much wider mortise than the actual biscuit itself. So don't worry about making those any wider. I would double them up though. Instead of having one in the center, I would have one 1/3 of the way down from the top and one 1/3 of the way up from the bottom. Cut those two in there, that's going to give it more rigidity up and down to keep the table from flexing, but that's enough room that that little football can move 1.5 millimeters either way inside the breadboard end, which is what I did over here. But when it comes to the domino, you have to have the wider setting and cut the oblong holes if you're going to pin it. For dowels, whether you're using the 1/4 inch or the 3/4 inch, you want to cut holes next to each other so that you have an oblong hole. If you choose to do the 3/4 inch dowels, treat them just like the biscuits or the dominoes with no pins, where if you want to, on your center, go ahead and drill straight through. That'll go straight through the breadboard and straight through your dowel. Put your 1/4 inch pin in and that'll help lock at least the center in place. And then with those floating mortises, you can go ahead and install the dowel in the table core side, and then it will be in that oblong hole that you just cut in the breadboard inside. It's enough to keep it from flexing up and down. It's not going to keep the breadboard tight to the table, but that's what your centermost piece is for. Now the last of these techniques that is also pretty cool does require a router, and I recommend a handheld router like this, but this is for splining your breadboard end, which is also a process you can do. Again, it sticks with my favorite old school that I did before I got the dominoes, which was to spline in each individual piece using the table saw. You can do the same thing with a router, and you can do that for your breadboard ends so that you can attach them properly and know that they're secure. So there's a couple different ways to do this, and that's going to depend on the thickness of your spline material. I do not have a 3/16 inch bit, but I do have a 1/4 inch bit. However, my spline material is 3/16 thick. I do have a piece of MDF, which is not really the best for this application, but it will work. But what's better than that is actual plywood, and I do have a true 1/4 inch plywood, but it's hard to get. I have to get it from one of my plywood suppliers. It's not available at any home stores, no matter what they say. All of their 1/4 inch plywood is not exactly a 1/4 inch. It's always going to be around 3/16. So just bear that in mind. If, unlike me, you can't get true 1/4 inch plywood and you don't want to use MDF that's 1/4 inch thick, go ahead and just double up your spline. Cut two 1¼ inch wide strips, glue them together, one on top of the other, and that's your spline. In fact, you don't even have to glue them together outside. You can put glue on them, sandwich them together, and stick them in the core of the dining table, and that will hold them together long enough for you to put everything together. The point being that then, instead of using a 1/4 inch bit, you can use a 3/8 inch bit, because the two combinations of 3/16, 3/16 is 6/16, which is 3/8. So you can use a 3/8 inch bit, and you can go ahead and cut your mortises using that. Again, going 3/4 inch deep on the core and 1 inch deep on the breadboard end. Now the last step before installing the breadboard end when using the splining technique is to go ahead and look at your reference marks. And we want to measure out 1/2 inch away from that, put a little mark there, and that's where we're going to drill an oblong hole. This is for that wood expansion we were talking about earlier. You do this oblong hole, and now when you go to put a pin through the breadboard end, it's going to go completely through this hole, but be held in place by the breadboard ends once installed, and that's going to allow for the expansion and contraction of the tabletop. Where the center mark is, all we're going to do is drill straight through, put a peg in place, and glue everything in place, but only on that center third. Once you've got those pins in place, you go ahead and cut them off with a flush cut saw or Japanese pull saw or whatever. If you did clamp up the table, which I do recommend you do, let it set at least overnight before unclamping it, and that's going to make sure that everything has cured in place, and you've got yourself a tabletop. Now it's time to sand it, finish it, and go impress somebody with it. Thanks for watching, y'all. That's pretty much it. If you have any other questions about assembling a tabletop, if you want to see how to do one exclusively with the Festool, or if you just want to see how to do a DIY dining table, I've got some videos that are posted as well. You can go ahead and find those on my page, and I think I'm going to have the link in the description as well, so you can check out some of those, and hopefully that'll help this stuff make more sense. None of this stuff is easy, but none of this stuff is all that hard. So just a little bit of experience, a little bit of knowledge, and absolutely no pocket holes. Hey, do me a favor and find me on social media. Hit me up on Facebook and Instagram at PMK Woodworking. I believe I'm on Twitter as well at PMK Woodworking. On there, I mostly just talk to like other makers and podcast people, and you know, I try not to get too political, but sometimes I do, and it's on there. Click on some of the links below if you have need for any of these tools. I've got some of the best deals that I was able to find with links in them for my Amazon store, so click on those, help support this channel. Maybe even click on some of those ads if you want to. Let me know if you end up doing any of these techniques. I want to know which one you used, and I want to see your final product. So hit me up on Instagram. I will feature you with a tag, and I will show your work on my Instagram page, and I'd definitely love for you guys tag me in your projects as well so I can see what it is you're working on, especially if it came from my channel. So once again, y'all, thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.